Hey there, it's Michelle Norris. I'm host of a podcast called Your Mama's Kitchen. When I travel, I'm usually looking for a way to find a taste of home when I'm not at home. And one of the things I love to do when I am at home is entertain. And Airbnb allows me to do that. When I was in California recently, I rented a house that had a great kitchen. And when we were sitting around the table, we're all thinking, we're in someone else's house. Someone could be in all of our homes as well. If you have a home, but you're not always at home, you have an Airbnb. Your home might be worth more than you think. Find out how much at airbnb.com/host.
Hello, David.
Yeah, hi, how are you?
How are you, sir? And welcome all to a chapter of my life with author David. Now, we do a weekly podcast, Terry Curran and myself, The Curran View, and we've been looking at your book. It's in the book corner. We didn't know whether your surname is Tossell or Tossell, so just clear that up first for us, please.
It's Tossell.
Okay, thank you. I was right, TC was wrong.
Yeah.
How are you, mate? Anyhow, you okay?
I'm good, yeah. Yeah, very good. Yeah.
Absolutely delighted to have the conversation with you today about your book. All crazy now. We're going to get into what it is all about and how crazy is it. I believe that it's your 17th book. You've done 16 to date. So let's briefly talk about your backstory.
Yeah. Well, I'm a long-time sports journalist, if you like. I've been working for the last 25 years now in public relations, head of public relations for the NFL, the American football folks, head of publicity for them in Europe. But I've been writing books sort of regularly, almost one a year now, for the last 20 years. And I think if anyone looks at the books that I've written, you can definitely see a recurring theme. They're all pretty much either historical or biographies, stories of people, stories of particular teams and events, and all largely from the sort of era that I grew up in, sort of 60s, 70s, 80s. So there's a definite theme there. I've been, very fortunate that I've been able to write about some of my heroes and have certainly interviewed many of my heroes, mostly football books, a few cricket, a rugby book about the Wales team in the 1970s. And I've been lucky, as I say, to interview many of my heroes, as you have in the stuff that you're doing. And the great thing is that almost to a man, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to guys from that era. They love to talk about the old times. They're very generous with their time, and that's the real joy of it, really. Apart from just the writing, is actually sort of sitting and talking to the guys.
Ultimately, who is your hero?
My all-time favourite footballer is not anyone who even won a single England cap, but it's John Sammels, who was Arsenal midfielder. I'm an Arsenal fan, sort of from the late 60s. He was one of the first players that I remember, for various silly reasons. There's the kind of reasons that stick out when you're a 7-year-old. His hairstyle was a little bit different to the rest of the team. It was the first time I'd ever seen a John spelt without an H. I loved just the way he played. He's scored what is still my favourite goal that I've seen live in a stadium, which was a sort of a 40-yarder against Manchester United in late '69. And funnily enough, when I kind of wrote my first football book, which was a book about the 1971 Arsenal double team, John was the first player I went to interview. And like everybody would know who's ever kind of met their heroes, it's always a bit nerve-wracking, and you think, is he actually going to be a nice guy? And he was the nicest man ever. We sat and chatted for 2 hours, and his wife made us lunch, and he was my hero all over again. So John Sammels would probably be my sort of favourite all-time footballer. But I'm lucky that I've Alan Ball was another one. I've written about him. In cricket, it was people like Tony Gregg, who I've written about. Rugby, my all-time hero, even though I'm not Welsh, was Gareth Edwards. And when I spoke to him when I was doing my book about the Welsh rugby team, such a gentleman. I mean, I was asking him questions that he'd probably been asked 1,000 times during his life, but he was one of those people who makes you feel like you're asking the questions for the first time, and he's very thoughtful and generous in his answers. So, stuff like that is what makes writing books like this, a real pleasure.
And how long does it take you to write the book? You did say that you try and do one every year. That is prolific by anybody's
Yeah,
imagination.
I don't set out necessarily to do one a year, but
Hmm.
I'm quite obsessive in my nature, if you like. So once I get cracked into something, I kind of do it regularly. I mean, I'm lucky that I'm not someone who needs to find a darkened room and hide themselves away to write. I can happily sit in the living room with laptop on my lap. Mrs. will be watching television. I'm sort of doing writing. So I'm able to do it in a way that is, reasonably sociable. I don't have to kind of shut myself away. My kids are all grown up, so I've got no sort of school runs or football lessons or ballet classes to take any kids to. So, my time outside of my day job is pretty much my own. So, and I always get to the end of one and think, right, I'll have a bit of a break here, but I've always got 3 or 4 ideas on the go already for the next one, and I just always want to crack straight into them. So I certainly don't set myself a target of a book a year, but it tends to work out that it's roughly between sort of 12 and 18 months for each book. The one that we're going to talk about, All Crazy Now, was probably a little bit longer than that because I'd written little bits of it on and off for maybe 10 years with a view to eventually wanting to write this sort of what I hoped was an all-encompassing book about the 1970s, and then kind of gone off and done other things. So even though it probably was a 12, 18 month intensive period to kind of get it done, I had already had a little bit done in advance.
And I'm guessing with some of the players that you've referenced, you've got a lot of stuff on the back burner that you can bring and put into the new book, All Crazy Now. The title's different. It's spelt like the way that Slade wrote the title to Mama, We're All Crazy Now.
Absolutely.
How did you come about that title? Were you a Slade fan, and did it come from that?
Absolutely, a massive Slade fan. One of the sort of first bands I remember. I think actually the first album I ever bought was Slade in 1972 or something, or it might have been Ziggy Stardust. It was one of those two at that time. But yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I wanted to do throughout the book was just kind of give a feeling of the time and the sort of the culture, the pop culture of the time, if you like, because I think it kind of helps sort of bring books like this to life. And so I was thinking of a title. I wanted it to be something that was very resonant of the 1970s. All Crazy Now that seemed to kind of capture it because it was a time when things were a little bit more. It was a little bit more of the Wild West, if you like, than it is now. People look at football now and it can be sort of quite sterile, if you like, in some ways, and very organised. But the 70s was still an era where it was a little bit more anything goes. So All Crazy Now kind of captured that a little bit, and to kind of give the sense of the time. I wanted to, I used the Slade spelling of it. So hopefully it works, and I think people of our generation would look at the book and understand straight away, what the relevance of it is.
As you would see with a house, the book, the cover, it brings you in, doesn't it? It would have what people would say, it's got doorstep appeal. The book cover has got book appeal. Another great title for it, and I don't know if you was thinking of titling it this, was Saturday Night's All Right for Fighting, because the 70s, you're right, it was like the Wild West, and there was almost as many fights on the pitch as what there was off the pitch, wasn't there?
Yeah. I mean, and that is actually one of the chapter titles. The title of the chapter that deals with the hooliganism that was a big part of 1970s football. So I've used that there, but I'm very pleased with the cover of it, and to the extent where when I saw it, I got the designer to actually send me a copy of it that I could then send on to one of these places that convert stuff into big canvas posters. So I've now got a big poster of it sort of sitting above my stairwell, because it is a sort of very much a sort of 1970s style cover, so it makes a nice sort of 1970s style poster. So yeah, I've been very pleased with it, and the cover shows Kevin Keegan and Billy Bremner in their sort of famous fight in the Charity Shield, which I wanted on the cover for a few reasons. Partly because it's just a great photo, and it features two of the sort of most iconic figures of the 70s, and also I explained in the introduction to the book that game is kind of marks a dividing line in the decade, really. It's kind of the crossover from the early 70s, where that was all sort of very much dominated by Leeds, and then leading into the second part, which was much more about Liverpool. So for various reasons, I wanted that picture on the cover, and I think the designer's done a fantastic job.
And also, if my memory serves me right, wasn't that 1974 Charity Shield the first one that involved the league champions and the FA Cup winners?
It wasn't the first, but it was the return to that. What had happened, it had been that for many years, and then when Arsenal did the double in 71, that kind of threw a bit of a spanner in the works, and Arsenal chose to play a sort of challenge series against Benfica rather than taking part in the Charity Shield. They ended up that year having Liverpool, who'd been the FA Cup runners-up, against Leicester, who'd been the second division champions. And for 3 seasons, it was always that sort of a weird combination. It was like the League Cup winners against the second division champions or something like that. And then in 74, the FA said, right, we want to bring this back to what it was supposed to be. So they shifted the game to Wembley, the first time being played at Wembley. They went to the league champions, Leeds, and the FA Cup holders, Liverpool, threw a load of money at them and said, look, we want the two top teams back in the game again. And from then on, it's been the top two at Wembley all the way through till current day.
Have you got any year that you would call your favourite year of the 70s?
I think from a storytelling point of view, it's probably the 1971-72 season, for a few reasons. One, it was still one of the most exciting and closest championship races. I mean, anyway, if you look at the league table for the end of the year, 1 point separating the top four teams. It wasn't decided till after the FA Cup final. I mean, the last Saturday of the season finished with Manchester City on top by 1 point. But ironically, they were the only one of the top four teams for whom it was mathematically impossible for them to win it. Yeah. Because of the games that were still to be played, Manchester City was certainly going to get overtaken. And then Leeds won the FA Cup, could have beaten Wolves to win the league 2 days later, failed, lost the game. It then meant Liverpool would win it if they won at Arsenal. They only drew, and it meant Derby, who were by that time sitting on a beach in Mallorca, were the champions. So it was a compelling title race between four of the most iconic managers of the time: Brian Clough, Don Revie, Malcolm Allison, and Bill Shankly. There was an awful lot going on around that season in terms of, big transfers that did and didn't happen. There was a clamp down by the FA on trying to get rid of some of the foul play that was creeping into the game. At the start of the season, there was what became known as the refs' revolution, where they were kind of booking players left, right and centre. And that whole battle for the soul of the game, if you like, that sort of whole argument about whether the game was becoming too physical was a big part of the early 70s narrative around English football. And so that season sort of captured a lot of those kind of elements. And so that would probably be one of my favourites. The other one, which isn't quite in the 70s, but I have included it in the book as my starting point of the 70s, would probably be the 68-69 season, because I think that was the first one that I remember the whole of the season. And I think everybody probably still remembers, the first season that they followed from start to finish. Everybody remembers their first World Cup and their first FA Cup final. So the 68-69 season also for me was probably the one where I kind of say, right, this was my first year as a real football fan. So those would be a couple that stand out. But I could make an argument. I could sit here all night making an argument for any one of the seasons, because I love them all.
Absolutely. Who were the standout players of the 70s? Who were the players for the people, that the kids of today, shall we say, that when they look at the 1970s, it was 50 years ago plus
Yeah.
now, and it's like, you know, Grandad's favourite player was X, Y, and Z, and we had the Mavericks. Are there any players in particular that keep cropping up in this story about, in my opinion, those golden days, those halcyon days of the golden decade, which was the 70s, our era? My absolute love in football was the 70s.
Yeah, and I think you kind of referenced them probably there. That group that became known as the Mavericks.
Yeah.
They are probably, they're such a big part of the story. Certainly in the first half of the decade, and as I just mentioned, they're one of the sort of the themes that is recurring in the early 70s. And if you look at old magazines and newspapers, there was constantly this argument about, is the game becoming too cynical? Is it becoming too much about, win at all costs? Are teams sort of playing to a system much more than is good for the game, and the individual is going out of it? And for that reason, there was this group of players who didn't conform, who kind of stood out because they were so different to what was going on around them. So it was the likes of Alan Hudson, Frank Worthington, Charlie George, Rodney Marsh, Stan Bowles, all the ones that are obvious names to people who kind of lived through the 70s. And their story is so fascinating that you look at a series of England managers who kind of overlooked them. And I make a point in my book that that group that I just mentioned, and throwing Peter Osgood in that as well, combined they won fewer England caps than, I think Glenn Johnson is the example I've given in the book. Nothing against Glenn Johnson, perfectly good, adequate, good right back, but it seems crazy to a lot of people that this group of talented players only won a very limited number of England caps because Ramsey and then Revie, they just weren't the kind of players that sort of fitted into their vision of an England team. And so there was this constant discussion in the media in the first half of the 70s about where those players fitted in, and the fact that they didn't fit in a lot of the time was sort of something that a lot of people saw as being obviously a bad development in the game, and not good for the way that the game was heading, and it was something that was used as an argument for why crowds were going down in the 70s, fewer goals were being scored. So there's players like that, but then within the systems there were some other fantastic players. I mean, I think Billy Bremner is a very underrated player. I think people remember him for the kind of picture that is on the cover of the book, getting into a fight, and they remember the sort of cynicism of the Leeds team. But Bremner was a terrific player. I mean, again, if you look at old Leeds films, the number of times he's making key contributions and scoring important goals, such a terrific player. And then you have someone who kind of was almost a poster boy for the 70s, Kevin Keegan. Probably very few players other than him have got as much out of, I don't want to say limited talent, but he certainly didn't have the natural skills that the Hudson or a Worthington had. But the way he kind of worked to make himself into the icon he was and the successful player he was, as I say, it almost kind of made him a poster boy for that new sort of ethos of football, where it was all about hard work and running yourself into the ground and never giving up. So, and then you move on to the late part of the decade. Kenny Dalglish takes over at Liverpool. What a terrific player he was. And one of my favourite players, John Robertson, outside left at Nottingham Forest. Very rare to see a player who was so much on the periphery of the field from a geographical point of view, never wandered in off the left wing, but basically being such a focal point of a team's attack. And you watch Forest games of the late 70s, and so much goes through him, which is kind of unusual for a player who was sort of stuck out on the wing. So there's a lot of those players, and hopefully I've told a lot of their stories throughout the book. And I've also, I kind of talk a lot about someone who could have been one of the Mavericks of the of the 70s, Peter Knowles at Wolves, who kind of gave it up just as the 70s were about to start to go and become a Jehovah's Witness. So, I've included his story in there as well, because I think that's very interesting. And it's very interesting to ponder what might have happened had he gone on and fulfilled his career, and how big a star he could have been in the 1970s.
God's footballer. I've done
That's the one.
Yeah, I've done an interview with Kenny a bit, and Kenny was saying he couldn't believe it. What Knowles had just said in the dressing room, I don't want you swearing, I don't want you doing this, I don't want you doing that, and I'm packing it in, and they're like, Knowles, are you having a laugh? And they honestly, and Wolves as a football club kept his registration alive for something like 10 seasons, because they were all convinced that Knowlesy was going to walk back in there, pick up his boots and carry on playing for Wolverhampton Wanderers, but he never.
No, that's right. And whatever you think of the decision he made, whether it was, it's right or wrong, or whether you agree with his beliefs or not, you have to admire the commitment to that decision. To walk away like that at the peak of his career, and to be determined that he was never going to come back and go through with it. Fantastic, speaks fantastically for his commitment, but a real loss to English football, and to Wolves fans particularly.
Absolutely. Derek Dougan, another player in the 70s, very much instrumental in a lot of things that went on in the 70s regarding the PFA, and also advertising. Didn't Derek bring the first advertising Kettering tyres to football, but they got banned originally?
That's right, yeah. And I wrote a book about Derek Dougan, for a lot of those reasons, was instrumental in such a lot that went on in football in the 60s and 70s, in his role as chairman of the PFA. And then, as you say, when he went to Kettering Town as manager and chief executive, the players told me they had no idea it was going to happen. They just turned up in the dressing room for, I think it was an FA Trophy game one night, and suddenly saw these shirts on hooks with Kettering tyres on them, and they ran out and wore them, and next thing they know, Dougan's being threatened with being fined by the FA, and all sorts of other threats being made. So his idea then was to sort of get around it by changing it to Kettering T, so which he said, well, it stands for Kettering Town, obviously, not just Kettering tyres, but they didn't let him get away with that either. And then a couple of years later, they were, the FA were sort of allowing teams to wear sponsors on their shirts anyway. But the story of sponsorship in the 1970s is interesting, and one that I sort of cover in the new book. I think the vision of Alan Hardacre, who was sort of head of the Football League at the early 70s, was that it would become a much bigger part of football much more quickly than it did. So in 1970, we saw the introduction of the Watney Cup, which was a pre-season tournament for English teams. Then there was the Texaco Cup, which was a kind of a sub-European tournament, if you like, for the best teams in England, Scotland and Ireland that hadn't qualified for Europe. And those tournaments did pretty well for a few years, and were, I guess, sort of trailblazers, if you like, in terms of sponsorship. And there, again, at the time, there was a lot of angst going on. And people worried that sponsorship was going to fundamentally change the nature of the sport. And you have quotes from people like Bobby Charlton saying, well, it's fair enough having a competition named after whatever, but don't expect me to run out on a football field with a beer company all over my shirt. But obviously that's the reality we now live in. And I think Alan Hardacre saw that coming a lot of years before it actually sort of really came to full fruition. And by the mid-70s, those tournaments had ended, and Hardacre was sort of lamenting the fact that they had gone, and was sort of worried that a lot of clubs were missing out on what at that time would have been a lot of vital income. So yeah, the story of sponsorship is again a big part of the development of the sport in the 70s. And I think one of the reasons why, for me, the 70s is such an interesting decade, because a lot of what we see and take for granted in football now had its roots in that time.
Jimmy Hill, another pioneer.
Yep. Was head of the PFA when the maximum wage was abolished in 61. Yep. And throughout the 70s, I mean, he was the voice of authority. I mean, and if you look back at now and watch clips of Jimmy Hill, or you listen to him on commentary, and you compare the sort of opinions and the kind of knowledge he had of the game, the way he analysed the game, you compare it to, you know, the likes of Gary Neville and whoever now, it seems so basic and not particularly thoughtful, and, you know, almost naive. But at the time, you know, Jimmy Hill carried an awful lot of weight in terms of his opinions. He was, you know, the first started the decade as the face of analysis on ITV, became the face of Match of the Day in about 73, had newspaper and magazine columns, you know, was chief executive at Coventry City, was hugely influential. And, you know, if Jimmy Hill said something, you know, people did sit up and listen. So, yeah, another major character of that time.
And the king of the free kick must have been Willie Carr of the 70s.
That's a shame that you can't really bring that goal to life in a book, but, you know, obviously do talk about it. I mean, you know, people would have seen it on YouTube that Willie Carr stands there against Everton at Highfield Road, Coventry, with the ball between his heels, flicks his heels up towards his backside, and the ball pops up in the air. Ernie Hunt bullies it in. I mean, what is remarkable about that goal is the good fortune that it happened. First of all, the good fortune that the ball went in the net, because I'm sure that, you know, that if they tried it 20 times in practice, they probably only got it in the net once. And the good fortune that it happened in front of the TV cameras, because, you know, as people will remember from those days, you had a couple of games on Match of the Day. You had, you know, a few regional games on ITV. You might get a news camera at one or two games. So there were an awful lot of first division games that never had cameras there, and the chances were greater that would have happened, and it would have been lost for all time, because, you know, very few people would have seen it. So it's a real fortunate turn of events that it happened to be a night when the Match of the Day cameras were there. And maybe that's why they saved it for the cameras. Maybe they'd been waiting for a game when they knew the cameras were going to be there to do it. But certainly was, you know, an incredible goal, and one that ended with the rules having to be changed, so that, you know, you're no longer able to do that the ball had to kind of pass through a complete sort of revolution before it was deemed to have been a legal free kick. So a shame about that, but, you know, so it made sure it was a one-off and would never be repeated.
The infamous donkey kick. But Willie done another free kick that probably, when you look at football in the 70s, changed or shaped the history of European football for Brian Clough. Because when Wolverhampton played Bolton Wanderers, while Forest were in the air, Willie Carr played a ball to Kenny Hibbett, and the ball nestled just inside Bolton Wanderers' goal, which promoted Nottingham Forest, and then the season after went on to win the league and then win the European Cup back to back, which for me is still the greatest feat of any English team, surely.
Oh, I would agree with that. Yeah, and it is remarkable, those fine margins. I mean, you know, and that, in a sense, what I mean, Forest's story is remarkable, but it wasn't like they stormed through the second division, won it by a mile, and everyone was thinking, gosh, this team could do really well in the first division. As you say, they kind of scraped to promotion thanks to someone else's efforts ultimately on the final night of the season. So no one had an inkling at all what was coming. And even, you know, they went up on the first day of the season and won at Everton. People were saying, well, you know, we've seen teams do this before. A newly promoted team comes up and they win their first game, but they're soon going to fizzle out. And I remember being, as an Arsenal fan, I remember being at what would have been, I think, their fourth game of the season. They'd won all three games going in, and then they came to Arsenal. And Arsenal walloped them. You know, it was 2 or 3-0, and Arsenal completely outplayed them. And we thought, right, that's the end of it. But then Brian Clough, you know, the genius manager that he was, went out and signed Peter Shilton. And he realised that this is what we're lacking. We need Peter Shilton. We need someone in goal who's going to, you know, give us that solid base. Signed Shilton, and, you know, they just went off on a run. And it is. I agree with you. I mean, as fantastic as Leicester's achievement was a few years ago to win the Premier League, and as unexpected as that was in this day and age, I think the fact that Forest sustained it over a couple of years, went on and won 2 European Cups, were rivals to the great Liverpool team as being the best team in the country for 2 or 3 years, is an astonishing achievement. And it becomes almost even more astonishing when you look at the fact that Clough had already done pretty much the same at another provincial team, if you like, in Derby County earlier in the decade, had taken them up, got them into the first division, won the first division, and but for some dodgy refereeing against Juventus in the European Cup semi-final, could have reached the final of the European Cup. So, he was very close to doing it twice. Whether or not you think Brian Clough was the greatest manager of the period or ever, I don't think you can argue too much that his achievement of taking 2 small teams like Derby and Nottingham Forest to the heights he did is an achievement that is pretty unrivaled.
I think Brian, in his own words, says, I might not have been the top manager, but I was in the top 1.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, Clough is inevitably a recurring character in the book. And I say at the end that in some ways he was probably the most dominant individual character in the UK of the decade. I mean, he was everywhere. I think, people probably who weren't around don't necessarily appreciate how ubiquitous a football manager could be. He was everywhere in the media because he spoke louder and had stronger opinions than everyone else. He was being interviewed on Parkinson on a Saturday night and the David Frost show, and he was being impersonated by Mike Yarwood on sort of Saturday night primetime TV, and it meant school kids like me were kind of all doing our own Brian Clough impersonations in the playground on the Monday morning, and he really was. He went beyond just football. He became one of the most dominant personalities in the whole of the country for that period.
And also the great Muhammad Ali. Clough, I've had enough.
Exactly.
Parky said, what are you going to do? I want to fight him. But that was Clough. I mean, he just, I think, epitomised everything that you'd want from a manager. And during that decade, as you say, he started there at Derby, and he went to Leeds United, Forest, Leeds United, Brighton Hove Albion. He had a few clubs in that decade, and going in at Leeds United, only lasting 44 days. It was quite incredible because Cloughy, through the media, probably had slagged Leeds United off more than anybody else, and famously on his first day told them to stick all the medals in dustbin because you've cheated.
Exactly. And again, that coming back to what we were talking about earlier, and the sort of the battle for football's soul, if you like, in the early 70s. The fact that Leeds had been so successful with a team that had kind of kicked and scrapped their way up the table, if you like, could be very cynical, even though they were a magnificently skillful team. And when Revie let them off the leash, they could play some absolutely wonderful football. They were never going to get rid of that reputation as being, a hard, cynical team. Epitomised probably by Johnny Giles, who was one of the most skillful players in the world, but wasn't afraid to kind of leave his boot in there and go over the top a bit, which was typical of Leeds. And Brian Clough's voice was probably one of the loudest of the early 70s period in kind of criticising them and saying that they were bad for football. I mean, that his downfall, his demise ultimately at Derby County, was triggered by the fact that he got himself a big fine for writing a piece in one of the newspapers where he said that the FA had missed a great opportunity to clean up the game when they only fined or gave Leeds a suspended fine for bad behaviour on the pitch. He said, they should have relegated them and made an example of them. And while Clough was probably.
Hey everyone, I'm Craig Robinson, co-host of the Ways to Win podcast, alongside my good friend John Calipari. I've been on the go recently, Phoenix, Kansas City, Chicago. If you're like me and have a home but aren't always at home, you have an Airbnb. Hosting your home or a spare room is a very practical side hustle. If you live in a big game town, you can Airbnb your place for fans to stay in. Your home might be worth more than you think. Find out how much at airbnb.com/host.
We're saying that partly in tongue-in-cheek. It got him a fine, and it meant that he fell out with his chairman at Derby, Sam Longson. Sam Longson was growing weary of the fact that he couldn't control Clough anymore, and that was really the beginning of the end for Clough at Derby, and ultimately led to him being the absolutely the most unlikely character to have turned up as being manager of that Leeds team. I mean, if you'd picked one person a year earlier to said, right, who do you think will be manager of Leeds United in a year's time when Don Revie takes over England, I think Brian Clough would have been bottom of the list. There was no way you could ever see Clough doing that. But that, I guess, was typical of him, that it was that sort of challenge that I guess he felt he couldn't resist. And when he was asked, how can you do things better than Don Revie? It was that, Don's won the league, but I think we can do it in more style. I want to give Leeds fans a team to be proud of. And only probably Clough would have had the arrogance to think that he could go in and do that. But as you say, famously went very wrong very quickly.
Arrogance or complete self-belief. Two sides, or two different sides of the same coin. I remember interviewing Alan Clark, and Clarkey said to me, Sniffer, Cloughie was the right man, but just at the wrong time. And the Leeds players had gone. The year before, Don Revie had a dream that he wanted the team to go unbeaten all year. And what they did, they turned up a week earlier than usual to start their pre-season training, and did when Brian Clough was the manager. Cloughie was still on holiday in Spain with the family, and Alan Clark said to me, when Brian Clough met us for the first time, he said he was a very, very nervous man. It was quite extraordinary the way that he took the job, B, the way it went, and ultimately ended. And Cloughie did at the end say, look, you are a great team, and Ali Barley, some of the things that I said I think quite mean, but it was a little bit too late and the damage had already been done.
Yeah, and I think that whole episode that was sort of captured famously in the film The Damned United, but there's a lot of things about The Damned United that people not necessarily say is 100% true, but I don't think there's any dispute that the gist of that first conversation has been captured perfectly. And as you said earlier about throwing the medals in the bin, that was probably Clough's way of hiding his own insecurity at going in there with all these players and thinking, I've got to do something to kind of make my mark. And had he thought about it, I'm sure he'd have gone about it in a different way. There's an interesting comment from Trevor Cherry that I quote in the book, saying that things could also have been very different had Jimmy Armfield been the one that came in to take over immediately from Don Revie, and then Clough had maybe come in a year or two later. So he hadn't been immediately following Revie. There'd been a sort of bit of a different period, and then Clough had come in. That could have made the story much different to what it turned out to be. Obviously, we'll never know.
100%. Another story of the 70s, Stan Bowles and Don Shanks and the Old Bailey.
You tell that one. You're going to have to remind me about that one.
There was a few things. There was certainly when the boys turned up at a McDonald's. They were going from the training ground to I think it was Hackney Dogs, and they'd cross London, and they parked outside this building. A week later, they'd done exactly the same, and I believe it was in Carlisle Dave's van, transit van. Well, the police were looking for this number plate. They'd seen this number plate, and Don Shanks had parked it up. Stan had gone. I'm not too sure whether it was McDonald's or whether it was Wimpy's. McDonald's might not have been over in the UK in them times, but Stan's come back with the food, and Shanks has got the arms up the back from the police that had come out the building, and Stan's looked at what the hell's going on here, and I think as a direct result of that, they found themselves in the Old Bailey. They also found themselves in trouble in Belgium when Don Shanks and Stan Bowles had a bet, a fiver, about Don would be able to get a brandy while all the bars are closed, and that is a fantastic story that Don tells so well. And also Stan Bowles, we can't not talk about the FA Cup and Stan Bowles, that game at Roker Park after they'd not long won the FA Cup.
Yeah, your Stan Bowles knowledge is greater than mine. You're going to remind the listeners about that one as well.
Again, it was on news at 10, wasn't it? Stan liked to bet. I mean, Uddy will tell you. Stan liked to bet. Shanksy will tell you. Stan liked to bet. Don liked to bet as well. All them boys liked to bet.
Yeah.
Well, the FA Cup was on show at Roker Park, and Stan had a bet with Don Shanks that he could knock the FA Cup off its
yes, I heard that one, yeah.
So the Sunderland fans wasn't too enamoured when I think Stan made contact and the FA Cup bit the dust. But
The interesting thing about stories like that and the kind of personalities of people like Bowles and Frank Worthington, we were talking about earlier, you know, managers would love them to have been, you know, more in line and not sort of quite as outrageous in their behaviour. But you know, there's always that question: if you've taken away that element of them, did that arrogance that meant Frank Worthington could, you know, go around bedding however many women in a week and, you know, write an autobiography that called One Hump or Two? If you take it, the arrogance that made him do that, was that the same arrogance that made him such a great player on the field and enabled him to score that wonderful goal that you know, people might have seen on YouTube of him playing for Bolton against Ipswich later in the decade? Or Stan Bowles and his love of life and, you know, those stories that you just related and his love of a bet. If you took that out of him, would it also have taken some of the essence of the way he played the game as well? So with a lot of those people, and I think it always seems to me that the managers who were most successful in managing those players were the ones who just accepted that was the way they were. You kind of dealt with it, you put up with it, you got the best out of them. If you tried to take too much of that out of their life, you were going to take important elements out of their game. And you know, to me, that's, you know, I think you just have to accept that that's what those players were, and that's part of what made them the great personalities on the field and the great players that they were.
100%. I said one of the first times that me and Uddy done a podcast again, I said, the thing is with you guys, Al, your brains were wired up different to ours. You saw things and done things on a football pitch that the normal fan, the normal player wouldn't even think about, and you did it. So you were just exceptional on the pitch. You were like that off the pitch. Why would we think that you come back off the pitch and just be a normal Joe? You guys were never going to be normal Joes. You were just Mavericks.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. That's kind of what made them stand out. And Alan Hudson again was one of my favourite players of the period. And the frustrating thing about Alan Hudson is you can't talk about Alan Hudson's career without thinking all the what ifs. You know, that ankle injury he got just before the 1970 FA Cup final that, you know, took him out of not only that game, certainly took him out of being a possible outside choice for the 1970 World Cup squad, and really meant that he was never quite the same player again. You know, as you know, when he went to Stoke, Tony Waddington always used to water the pitch for him, so that it was a little bit softer and wasn't too hard on his ankles. And then, you know, what if Don Revie had actually kept him in the England team after he played those two brilliant games at the start of his England career, but then never picked him again. And Peter Osgood, I mean, such a great player he was, but again, he was someone who'd suffered a serious injury early in his career, with broken leg, and people always said that he, as good as Osgood was, he could have been even better if he hadn't had that injury. So in any story like this, there's always a lot of those what ifs, and it's kind of it's partly fun and it's partly frustrating to kind of ponder on those things. I was, as I said, an Arsenal fan. I mean, I always say that when people ask me the best player I've seen at Arsenal, I always say for a 3 or 4 month period at the end of the 77-78 season, when Hudson came back into the Arsenal team, was playing with Brady and Ricks, I've never seen anyone play better in an Arsenal shirt for a short period of time than Hudson did then. But again, was suffering from long-term injuries and, had that brief period, but then, couldn't sustain it. So, yeah, his story, along with the likes of Bowles and all those, it tends to be one of frustration more than achievement.
And again, at Arsenal, Uddy didn't have a medical. He got an injury, and Terry Neill didn't believe that he'd got an injury. That was half the battle. Hudson signed for Arsenal when he wasn't fit. They then had the pre-season tour of Singapore and Australia, and famously Super Mac and Allen got sent back home. But Geordie was in that trio as well. Now, in fact, they were round the swimming baths, and Jock Stein said, "I can't help but notice, boys, but you don't really get on with your manager, do you?" And that was a lot of the problems. Terry Neill, when Don Howe come in, it changed a little bit, but it was a little bit too late for Al. And then, we went after the 78 FA Cup final, they had a steward's inquiry, and Hudson pretty much blamed Terry Neill, and Terry Neill jumped over and tried to throttle him, and the relationship really didn't improve, and probably the worst part of the relationship was on a flight to, I think they were on the way to Sydney, when they were going up to the bar and having a couple of drinks, and Terry Neill had already seen Uddy go up with Malcolm once, so he went up and says, "Oh, you've been up here once." He was having a beer with Jock Stein, and he says, "Look, it's been a long time since I've had a word and talked to a proper manager, so if you don't mind." And that didn't go down very well with Terry Neill as well. So there was a lot of mitigating things with Terry Neill and Alan Hudson. But you're right, what an absolute player. Superstars, another fantastic series in the 70s. As with the 3 Degrees, we had a lot of black players come into the game when, Big Ron at West Bromwich Albion. And the home internationals was a staple for every football fan, especially England versus Scotland. I remember saying to me dad as a kid, "Dad, is this at Hampden or Wembley?" It's at Wembley, son.
Yeah.
Blimey.
Yeah. No, the home internationals, I mean, again, coming back to talking about 68, 69 earlier, 68, 69 was the first year they moved the home internationals to 1 week at the end of the season, and every game was on TV.
Yeah.
Now, you talk to people who only know the modern era of TV when you've got 4 or 5 games on pretty much every day that you can watch from all over the world. I think people don't understand how starved we were of live football, and that whole thrill of just watching a game, knowing it was actually taking place at that moment, and you were watching a game without knowing what the result was going to be, was just so thrilling. And then so suddenly you get you'd get the FA Cup final live, and you might get the European Cup final. But just suddenly for them to say, right, we've got a whole week of live football, 5 or 6 games, the home internationals, everyone going to be live, a Saturday afternoon, then Saturday evening, couple of midweek games, and then England, Scotland on the final Saturday. It was, it was like you'd died and gone to heaven if you were a young football fan. So yeah, it was fantastically exciting for a while. That whole ability to see live games. Even again, I mentioned it in the book, the 1971 Anglo-Italian Cup final, Bologna versus Blackpool. It was live on grandstand on a Saturday afternoon. Live football on a Saturday afternoon. This again was unheard of. So millions sat there watching the final of the Anglo-Italian Cup, which some people might remember as a tin pot tournament, but it was live club football on English television, so we all sat there and watched it. Such a different era. But yeah, so many good storylines. You mentioned the rise of the black players there, and obviously there's a whole chapter on that in the book. Sort of starting really at the beginning of the decade with West Ham and guys like Clyde Best and A.D. Coker and the Charles brothers, going through the middle of the decade where someone like Laurie Cunningham was coming through, and talking about the development of the black player and the way they were perceived by the media and on the terraces. Always looked at as being a bit of a novelty, if you like, in the first instance, which probably in some way protected them from some of the real sort of vitriol and hatred that was thrown at them later in the decade, when more black players were coming through and were maybe perceived as more of a threat to some people on some terraces. When Clyde Best was, even though he did, he talks in his autobiography about having received a threat that someone was going to throw acid in his face. To most football fans, Clyde Best was this sort of, quirky, lovable character, and we all liked watching him play. But by the 70s, by the late 70s, when you had the three guys at West Brom, you had a lot of players elsewhere. There was it was a feeling of things starting to turn nasty. And I was on the North Bank at Highbury in it would have been early 1978 when Bob Hazel of Wolves got sent off for hitting Graham Ricks late in an FA Cup game, and the feeling of hatred towards him as he kind of walked off in front of the North Bank towards the tunnel. Even as someone who was a teenager then and not particularly aware of these things, even I could sort of sense that this just doesn't feel right. This just feels like it's gone way beyond banter. It actually feels really nasty. So there's definitely the story of the black players' experience throughout the decade is another important episode in the book.
Do you cover European football as well? Not the European Cups, because in those days we had the European Cup, the Cup Winners' Cup, the UEFA Cup, and there's some great books about that by Stephen Scraggs, certainly the UEFA Cup and the Cup Winners' Cup that's out on Pitch Publishing, which I believe Pitch are publishing your book as well,
Correct.
aren't they?
That's right, that's right.
But the overseas players, the likes of Johan Cruyff, the greatest team never to win the World Cup for me, well, there's three. Hungary, I was a bit too young though to appreciate them, in 1954. In 74, Holland, and then in 82, Brazil. Iconic sides, but that team, that Holland, that orange team, the Cruyff turn. In 76, we seen the Panenka. In fact, when you look at football today, everything started in the 70s.
I'm not going to argue with that. But no, I don't. The book is the subtitle of the book is English Football and Footballers in the 1970s. So I've tried to. I'd still be writing it, in 10 years' time if I tried to take in everything. So European football is mentioned in the context of, the English team's participation and what they did. But the stories start to merge, if you like, at the end of the decade, and famously in sort of 78, 79, when suddenly we started getting an influx of overseas players into the English game. Started with Tottenham going to Argentina and signing Ozzy Ardiles and Ricky Villa, who just won the World Cup with Argentina. But then there was a period of, you look at the newspapers from that time, and every day the story was which big world or European player the next English team was going to sign. So, Arsenal was supposedly after Ruud Krol and Johan Neeskens, and then Johan Cruyff was leaving Barcelona, and for a long time it looked like he might be coming to English football. He ended up going to the States instead. But then you had the Arnold Muren coming into Ipswich. You had the very unlikely, probably the most unlikely of all of that period of Argentina's Alberto Tarantini going to Birmingham City, which always sort of seems a bit of an odd one to me. Maybe not quite as odd as a few years later as Alan Simonson going to Charlton Athletic, but certainly up there. That's I guess a bit of a merging. And again, as you say, what you can say that everything started in the 70s. Certainly that was the start of the major influx of overseas players. There'd been a few earlier on, but in 78. Sort of driven by European law, if you like. The Football League had to do away with the sort of residence requirement that had originally been needed for someone from overseas to play in English football. They were allowed to now sort of start signing overseas players. So big furore at the time about guys coming over taking our jobs and whether it was going to affect the English team. And even though we were talking about the odd player here and there, there was a big hue and cry about it. And whereas obviously today the English players in the Premier League are in the minority. So very interesting time, and certainly the start of a new era when you look at the players that came in at the end of the 70s.
And you also dispel a myth or two in your book as well, certainly about the Horse of the Year show. It didn't happen.
That's such one of my bugbears. It's one of these things that has become accepted fact. And the players who played in either the three games that were always affected: the 1969 League Cup final, Arsenal v Swindon; the 69 League Cup final, the 1970 League Cup final, Man City West Brom; and most famously the 1970 FA Cup final, Chelsea Leeds. You always hear the players saying, the pitch was terrible, because they held the Horse of the Year show the week before. Mm-hmm. Now, the Horse of the Year show must have been held about 3 times a year, if that was true. But I was determined to check my facts on this. In fact, first of all, it was the Royal International Horse Show, not the Horse of the Year show. And it was held at Wembley Stadium in the summer of 68 and 69. But the pitch just never recovered. And I quote a few groundsmen who were involved at the time, saying, they put a load of grass down after the first time they'd held it. They had heavy rain. The roots of the grass never took. So when they held the horse show again a year later, it just instantly pulled it all up. And then by that time you were getting into another new season. There was no time to do anything about it. And it really is a criminal shame almost of English football. If you look at the 1970 FA Cup final in particular, I mean, as soon as the ball is kicked and as soon as the first few steps are taken, that sort of mud and sand that covers the pitch has just got footprints, like someone walking on the sand on the beach. And the fact that Chelsea and Leeds were able to produce such a great game is a testament to them. But it's staggering, really. And when you hear people comparing the players of today with the players that we've been talking about, would Alan Hudson have been as good in his day, or even defending was nowhere near the level of skill that you get now. Stoppers were stoppers then, and they just booted the ball anywhere. But in general, levels of skill are much higher today, A, because of the way the players train, and B, because of the playing surface they were playing on. If a Peter Simpson was playing now, he'd be just as cultured as a defender as Virgil van Dijk or whatever.
Absolutely.
Players would adapt to the conditions that they're faced with. So it is, it would have been great seeing some of the great players of that era playing on the kind of surfaces week in, week out that the guys get to play on now.
I had the good fortune of meeting up with Frank Worthington a few times, and I asked him that question, and Frank just rolled his chair back and said, "Son, great players fit into any era of football," and started singing "It's Now or Never" to me. That was his favourite song.
Yeah, absolutely true. In any sport, in any era, Gary Sobers would be a great cricketer now. Donald Bradman would be scoring a load of runs now, because they clearly had what was needed to get the most out of their game at that time, and they would be doing exactly the same now with all the benefits that they would have of modern training and modern pitches and whatever else. So yes, you can look at, I'm a massive fan of 1970s football. It's my favourite era, but I'm not so blind that I can't watch some highlights from a 1970s game and realise that some of the skill is just nowhere near the level of the skill that players have today. But that's because the game is very different. And if those same players were transported forward 40, 50 years, they'd be playing the same kind of football that the guys are playing now.
Absolutely. And we didn't have VAR in them days, but we still had ghost goals.
We did, yeah. I mean, Alan Hudson,
Ipswich.
Alan Hudson scored against Ipswich. The ball actually went outside the net and came out again. I mean, Leeds United fans have never forgiven Ray Tinkler,
Oh,
who effectively, they will argue, cost them two league titles. I
Yep.
mean, he cost them what probably should have been a goal that was allowed in 71, which meant that they finished a point behind Arsenal. And then because of the riot that ensued, it meant that they had to play their first few away games, the first few home games of the next season on neutral ground, didn't get maximum points from them, and ended up losing that season's league by 1 point as well. So, Leeds fans definitely have would have welcomed VAR in those days.
Absolutely. What's next on the horizon? And just before you tell me, let's just briefly look at, because when you were saying great players fit into any, and you're absolutely right, the book that you wrote, Natural, about the greatest goal scorer ever, Jimmy Greaves.
Jimmy Greaves.
Yeah.
Again, huge amount of fun to write the book. Wrote it a couple of years ago now. Just felt that he was someone that, no one had really written a book about him. He'd written a few himself, but I always think that there's room for a book by and about the same person. You get a very different story. Jimmy was famously A, very modest, and B, not very good at analysing what made him so good. And also, I find with autobiographies, they don't tend not to put things in sort of historical context necessarily. And I wanted to kind of give a nice rounded story of Jimmy. And I think his story is remarkable for a few reasons. Partly for what a great player he was. You've got the sort of the dramatic storylines of missing the World Cup final. And then you have that whole period of the 70s where he disappears into this sort of well of alcoholism, and then literally overnight decides, that's it, I'm done with drinking, comes out of it, and then reinvents himself as one of the most sort of popular TV personalities of the 1980s. And I think the fact that he managed to do that without ever allowing the alcoholism to be what defined him is a remarkable story. I think people still think of Jimmy Greaves, the footballer, or Jimmy Greaves, the TV presenter, and then reformed alcoholic is kind of further down. Whereas some players who have gone through the same thing, for good reasons sometimes. So, for example, Tony Adams, because he's made a career of helping people that have been in his situation, that tends to be the thing you think of almost first with him before you think of the cups and the caps. Whereas Jimmy went a different direction. He decided, right, I'm done with it now. I'm going to talk about it. I'll write a book about it, and that's it. I'm finished with it. I'm going to go on and go down a different path. And I think he doesn't always necessarily get the credit for the career he had on the field, particularly when now everyone talks about goals in the Premier League era and kind of tend to forget about anything before that. And he doesn't necessarily get the credit for reinventing himself as a TV personality after everything he went through. So the story, which to me was a fascinating one to tell. I was lucky that I got the cooperation of Jimmy's family to write it, and very sad that I went and met Jimmy, and he's been in a very bad way since the stroke he had in 2015. So I was honoured to be able to sort of meet him and write a book about him that's happily got well received, and and I was very pleased to write it.
Yeah, an absolute legend. 357 English league goals at a rate of 0.69. He was like a rabid dog with a bone, wasn't he, inside that box, Jimmy Greaves? The greatest. Fantastic.
Yeah. I mean, some of his goals, if people have not seen it, look up Jimmy Greaves v Manchester United 1965. Some of those goals he scored, or he had this way of running where if you just looked at him from the waist upwards while he was running, you'd think he was on sort of casters or something, and was just kind of coming along so smoothly. There was no effort about anything he did. And again, one of the reasons why I called the book Natural, because on the field he was a natural. On TV, he was a natural. He famously didn't want to use autocue or anything else. He kind of said what came to him, which sometimes got him in a bit of trouble. But, doing things naturally was just the way he approached everything. So that seemed to me to be the ideal title for it.
Absolutely. And if you want to look on YouTube, look at The Elusive Ghost with Michael Doherty when he talks about Jimmy, and that just about sums Jimmy Greaves up. So what's next on the horizon then, David? What are you writing about now?
I've just actually literally today as we speak have signed a contract with Pitch again for a biography of Don Howe, which
Brilliant.
I'm working on, which been able to speak to many of the people that have worked with him, and also will be working on another cricket story, cricket book, as I finish up Don Howe. That's one that I've kind of had on the back burner for a while. And then after that, if depending on how this book about the 70s gets received, it's very tempting then to kind of go on and do the same job on the 80s. So we'll see, but certainly going to have plenty going on.
Good man. Can I wish you all the very best? It's out in February, I believe. Is it
correct?
Just after Valentine's Day? So
February the 15th.
Yeah.
February the 15th, which to people of my age will remember, it will be 50 years to the day that we went decimal. So instead of having to pay £20 and whatever shillings for it, you're buying it in decimal now. So yeah, it's the 50th anniversary of that. That's February the 15th.
And also the anniversary of a young man from Birmingham, born in Plymouth, come to Birmingham, wonder boy, age 16, scored 4 goals against Bolton Wanderers. That was Birmingham's first home game after decimalisation.
Right, wow, there you go. Yeah, Trevor Francis, and again, a big part of the story. And ironically, massive star at the beginning of the decade, and then but needed to wait till the end of the decade to really have his moment in the sun with Nottingham Forest and England. So yeah, another fascinating character from that period.
And again, the first £1 million player, how times change. And we could go on all night referencing players. A player that we haven't talked about much, Tony Curry, was another one of those players. The 70s was just littered with great memories of fantastic football players. How can people purchase the book? We know it's out on the 15th. How and what's the easiest way?
15th of February. The easiest way is always via the usual sort of online sites, but if shops are open anytime soon, then it'll be in all the big stores as well. So yeah, should be easy to purchase, hopefully, and I'm hoping people enjoy it, and I'm hoping that there will be enough in there for people of our generation who kind of remember it firsthand and kind of can relate some of their own experiences, but also people who have heard about the 70s and seen little bits of it, and just read about people and know some of their stories. Hopefully there will be stuff in there that will interest them and maybe understand where football as we know it today has come from.
Absolutely, and I know what my missus is going to get for Valentine's this year, mate.
Excellent. You old romantic, you.
She's going to love it. I've got my Stan Bowles calendar and my Alan Hudson calendar in the kitchen. She's just walked in. I'm going to give about 10 seconds and I'm going to hear a right row. Get that off my wall. Benny Stein, mate, can I thank you so much? What a wonderful trip down memory lane. All the best with the book, and we will talk again promoting your other books as well, pal.
Thanks a lot, Gabbie. Appreciate it.
And best wishes to everybody at Pitch as well. Thank you very much.